Hey, I'm Roland with Mobile Geeks, and this is our review of the Nokia X. So, what's the Nokia X? The Nokia X is the long rumored and now finally available Android-based smartphone from Nokia that is supposed to do a good job in the low-end markets and especially in emerging markets where people are yawning for devices from companies like Nokia who are building high-quality phones and to be released with Android, but this one is special because as you can see, it has its own breed of Android on here. But let's talk about the hardware first. So we have a 4-inch screen, 800 by 480 resolution. It's an IPS panel. Underneath that is a Qualcomm MSM 8225 Snapdragon 4 S4 Play. So that is a dual-core 1 gigahertz chip. It's combined with 512 megabytes of RAM and 4 gigs of onboard flash storage. There is a micro SD card slot, but I'll show you that in a second. On the front, you don't have any camera or anything. The only thing you'll get up here is a distance sensor and a light sensor. Right next to that is the earpiece, and on the bottom, that is the only capacitive button that this device has. That is a back button, so that always gets you back to the home screen. If you hold it, if you're in an app and you hold the button, it will vibrate twice and get you back to the home screen. What you'll notice on the front, on the corners, is that there's a bunch of extra material in here. So when you drop it, these are probably supposed to be absorbing shocks, and that's a nice and cheap way and hopefully effective way to make it a bit more rugged. If you look at the device from the side, you'll see that it is not the thinnest of all smartphones. So this is just over 10 millimeters thick, and it feels and looks a bit chunky, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing, actually. This one is the very, very bright red version. On the back, you'll see a 3 megapixel camera right here. There's the Nokia logo. And in the bottom right, you get a speaker that is very, very capable and puts out a very loud sound. On the left of the device, there's pretty much nothing. On top, we have a 3.5 millimeter headset jack. And on the right, you get the typical volume rocker and an on and off button right there. On the bottom, there's a single micro USB port. What Nokia does right here is they don't put a separate USB cable for the charger into the packaging, so you have to get a separate cable from another source to actually plug this into your computer because the cable that's on the charger is affixed to the charger and you can't get that one off. Let's open it up for a second and take a quick look inside because there's a bunch of special features or just a special feature on this. First, a quick look at the pretty thick corners and pretty thick walls of the casing that is fully removable and covers the edges of the device too. Again, that's the 3 megapixel camera, but right here you get a 3G capable first SIM card slot. You have a micro SD card slot right there for storage extension up to 32 gigabytes, I think. Plus, you get a second SIM card slot. So this is actually a dual SIM device, but the second SIM slot is only 2G capable. This is the removable 1500 milliampere hour battery that gives you a pretty good runtime. So I made it through close to 2 days on one charge, but I'm not that much of a heavy smartphone user. Let's take a quick look at the screen for a second. Colors are pretty good. They tend to be washed out a bit in the bright sunlight, but it's definitely a good, easily readable screen for when you're outside. I mean, you won't be standing in direct sunlight and be able to read anything. It doesn't have high brightness mode or whatever that the Lumia devices have, or many of the Lumia devices, at least the higher priced ones have, but it's definitely a good screen. It does have 800 by 480 as I said, and it's an IPS panel, so the viewing angles are pretty decent. They're not super, not the best, but they're pretty good actually. This is another special feature of this device that only Nokia has been doing so far in the Android world. It's their so-called grand screen, as you might know from the Lumia devices. So this shows you the time when the screen is turned off, and it also shows notifications for new messages or appointments or other stuff that apps from the device push to the grand screen. One thing I noticed about the screen is that it is not the most high quality screen. So for once, you don't get any fingerprint repellent coating or you don't get a Gorilla Glass cover. And another thing is that when you're using the device in darker areas, you will notice that there is some light shining through. In my case, it's coming from down here. So it's not the highest panel, so highest quality panel. So sometimes the light will shine through on the borders or on the corners or the edges of the screen. The hardware itself is pretty capable, so the Qualcomm chip that is a dual-core 1 gigahertz is doing a pretty good job on this device, but there's a bunch of areas where it will start to slow down. So if you look at it closely, you will see that it's scrolling very smoothly while I'm up here in these white to color or these two color mode kind of tiles. But soon as you scroll down here and get to these icons that are a bit more colorful, it will start to stutter a bit, and that is highly noticeable, at least in real life. I don't know if the camera can actually capture that good for you guys. Talking about the performance, so benchmark wise, it's doing a pretty good job on the Antutu benchmark, for example. So you will score just over 7,500 points in this standard build running Nokia X's or the Nokia X software platform. That's what they are calling this Jelly Bean based Android AOSP 4.1.2 version, I think. So talking about the performance, it will sometimes tend to lag a bit. So starting apps like Facebook or Twitter or other apps that haven't been loaded before will sometimes take a while. But actually it is doing a pretty good job. But Nokia should definitely invest more in the optimization of their software platform that they're using on here. The interface is definitely a slowdown point on this device. If you have an Android build installed, it will show you that there's a bit more performance to be had when using the standard launcher from Jelly Bean or, for example, the Google Now launcher that you know from Nexus devices, which can also be installed on here. But first you have to root the device in this case. So next up is the camera, and the camera app is pretty decently spec'd, so you get a bunch of features. For example, you can set the white balance, or you can play around with exposure. You have a bunch of other different settings, but what's the biggest disadvantage about this is that it is only a 3 megapixel camera that will not make or not take the best pictures. You don't have any autofocus or a flash. So without the autofocus, you always have to make sure that you're far enough away from the subject. Macro shots are pretty much impossible, and it does tend to screw up on the white balancing quite a bit. Video resolution is pretty much the same, so when you switch to the video mode right here, the highest resolution you can do on this device is actually FWVGA, so that's 854 by 480 pixels. And the frame rate is also very low at only 9 frames a second in this mode. There's also a panorama function on the camera, but that also doesn't do a too good of a job because it only has a super low resolution and the camera itself is pretty crappy. The call quality on the Nokia X was, in my case, pretty good. It could have been a bit louder, but definitely a good speaker up top there, and it does a pretty good job of hanging on to calls, and yeah, in my case, it did pretty well. As I said earlier, this is actually a dual SIM device, so you get 2 SIM card slots, but what you have to know is that the first SIM card slot is the only one that is actually 3G capable, and the download speeds are also pretty limited, so you only get 7.2 megabits through UMTS 3G standard, and that is definitely a slowdown on when you're used to faster devices that are maybe even LTE capable, for example. But for emerging markets, as where this is geared towards, that's pretty decent. And having 2 SIM card slots is actually pretty useful, so you can combine your 3G SIM card from another contract with your, for example, prepaid SIM in the second slot that is only 2G capable. The battery life, as I said, is pretty much okay. So the software part is actually what is giving this thing a bit of a letdown. As I said, the performance is not the best because of the interface that hasn't been fully optimized. It is pretty weird for an Android user, or if you've been using Android earlier, to play around with this device, especially with the home screen. It does have its advantages, for example, that search bar that popped up there, and the so-called fast lane on here is definitely a nice feature because that's a good way to deal with all the notifications and stuff. Also, you'll reach the alarm up there, and it also shows you appointments in that thing that gets displayed when you scroll down here. So the fast lane is definitely a good idea from Nokia to keep up with all the notification stuff that sometimes tend to clutter your notification menu on other devices. In this case, the so-called info center, or whatever you want to call it, is only a menu that gives you an overview of your two SIM cards that are always showing in this bar up there, and you get a couple of quick settings up here, quick access to the settings menu, and it also shows you which Wi-Fi you're connected to. The single home button down here is another thing that you'll have to get used to. Since it doesn't have any of the other Android buttons, it's pretty hard to multitask on this. So multitasking is mostly done through the fast lane, and there's not really a way to shut down apps entirely. You always get back to the home screen by holding this button down here, and it will double vibrate and get you back to the home screen, but that is definitely something that is not the most thought through. There's an option to actually delete apps you've opened or delete other content that's in the fast lane. So you just hold the items and up comes this X right here, and you can delete everything or delete single entries, but there's no real way of multitasking on this device. So sometimes when you need a bit of speed, it will start to clutter up having all these apps running, and they're probably only getting dropped out of memory once there's not enough memory left anymore. Software-wise, there's pretty much everything you'll ever need on this device. So you have all the basic features, for example, contacts, messaging, a calling section. You have the internet browser that is a modified browser that Nokia is calling its own Nokia browser. As you can see, it tends to take a while to start apps. There's also their own store in which you have access to lots and lots of Android apps, but not as many apps as on the Play Store. And there's also a bunch of problems running apps that are running on different other Google-based devices because of the missing Google services. So most apps should work fine, and Nokia is working with many developers to actually have their apps ported to their Nokia store. And what they're doing there is mostly replacing the dependency on the Google services. And in this case, it will start working after they're done on that work. So right now, you mostly will have, or sometimes you'll end up with apps that are not in the store from Nokia. In this case, it's 3D Mark. But Nokia will also offer you access to a bunch of other app stores that also are separate apps, and you'll have to install these. But once you've done that, you can actually access these and try to get the apps from there. So in this case, it's the Yandex store from Russia and One Mobile Market. I haven't tried the other ones, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the apps will work. For example, I installed 3D Mark on here, and I'm sad to tell you that it doesn't run right now. It starts the app, but you can't really use the app because it can't find its resources. So for the most part, everything is there that a basic smartphone user should need. Most of the apps are already working, but Nokia definitely has to do a bunch of optimization there, and they definitely need to work with more developers to get stuff ported to their own Nokia store. One thing I need to talk about is that there is an option to actually install Google services on here, so you can root the device, install Google Play, for example, and try to have apps installed on here, including ones from Play Store and ones using Google services. So you can actually get Gmail running on here, but you'll have to root the device and risk your warranty on this. There's also a bunch of people from the XDA developer forums that are actively working on modifying this device to actually get pure Android running on here, and we'll talk about that later on in a bunch of other videos. So software-wise, it's definitely some way to go for Nokia right here, because they're not fully done porting stuff, and there's definitely work to be done on the interface because it sometimes is pretty laggy. There's also a bunch of nice features. For example, as I said, the clock that shows up right here, and also you can double tap the device to wake it up. You have to hit the screen pretty hard to actually make it work. There you go. Because Nokia is doing something funny right here. They're not using the touchscreen itself, probably to save battery life, but what they're doing is I think they're using the accelerometer. So if you hit the table like this, it will also turn on the screen. Overall, I would say that the Nokia X is doing a good job hardware-wise. There's everything in there that you need. The RAM is definitely enough, close to enough, because it's only 512 megs, and it will slow you down sometimes. 4 gigs of RAM, there could be more, but it's also all right, and you can extend the memory, and you can have apps put their stuff on the SD card, because we're still using an older Android build on here, so that doesn't work on the KitKat anymore. And yeah, the camera is pretty much unusable. Battery life is totally fine. The screen is also pretty much all right. It feels very solid. It feels more like a flagship device than some other manufacturers' flagship devices. They tend to be pretty flimsy, but this is solid as rock, and you can actually throw this through Windows, and it probably is not going to suffer a bit. So Nokia is definitely showing some potential running their own Android on here, and sometimes it tends to be a bit sad that Nokia is getting acquired by Microsoft right now, and we'll probably not see more Android devices from them. But let's not paint it black, because Nokia still keeps some of their phone people with them, and there might be the chance that we're seeing more of these Nokia devices. So for now, this has been Rolling with Mobile Geeks, checking out the Nokia X, which is definitely a nice buy if you like modding your devices.
What?